Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 1st of March and we're entering into a new month with so much news to cover. We're going to look primarily at the Kursk region today because we have news of the Russian forces crossing into Ukrainian territory in Sumy Oblast in two specific locations. So we'll look at the frontline dynamics over there in addition to Russian advances deeper and deeper into the Ukrainian possessions within Kursk. I also want to look at some of the updates and some of the aftermath of the meeting between Trump and Zelensky, a new aid loan announced by Keir Starmer after Zelensky's meeting with him today. And if you guys are interested in even more in-depth coverage of everything, then follow me on Twitter because I'm now pledging to be very active over there. So please like and subscribe, and let's get into the video. So over here, you can see in yellow, these are the latest advances by the Russian forces. They're now verified based on confirmation from the Ukrainian side. I was very wary of changing the marking of this region just north of Zuravka and Novenke because for a very long time we had zero indication of whether the Russians were actually able to get a footprint over here. We knew for sure that the Russian forces were located in Darino, in Nizhny Klin, and in Sverdlikovo, but there was never any solid indication of the Russian forces entering into Nikolaevka Darino. But now, following reports from Deep St. Petrenko, we are able to adjust the mapping and show that the Russian forces are in control of these 22 square kilometers that include the village of Nikolaevo Darino, and then also the vast swaths of open fields that are also located on pretty high elevation that overlook some of the Ukrainian positions in nearby valleys where you have just like chains of villages connected to one another. They're also pretty important because you have some of the key roads leading to the front line that are all passing through those villages on low elevation. So the Russians are getting control over key hills that overlook all of those logistics networks. So just to zoom in over here, you can see that the Russian forces are pretty close to seizing the entirety of the border and the gray zone between Sumy and Kursk, although they have not taken over physically the anti-tank ditches that they physically built themselves over a year ago during the Surovikin era that are exactly like a couple of meters away from the border with the Ukrainian side. Now, there are reports now that are being released from the Russian side and some mimicked by the Ukrainians about an entrance by the Russian forces into Sumy Oblast. The one area where it seems to be the most likely is in Novenke, and this comes following the Russians really consolidating their positions in Sverdlikovo and retaining control over there for a couple of days now, meaning that the ability to build up their forces once again and shift to the next assignment. And so, at the very least, there's a gray zone. It could actually be under the control of Russian forces by now, but I'm going to wait and see. And I won't say anything definitive, but just taking the most charitable scenario based on Ukrainian reports, I'm going to say that this 2.3 square kilometer piece of territory that is directly south of Sverdlikovo, which is connected to it by like a paved road, Novenke specifically, is in a gray zone right now. And I can't change the polygon over here for Ukraine's control in Sumy, so I'm going to have to work on that later on. But for now, just know that this black polygon indicates a gray zone. And the Russians actually had an opportunity to exploit the capture of Sverdlikovo last week and achieve an even deeper breakthrough into Basivka, but that situation never came into fruition because the Ukrainian forces desperately moved in large columns of vehicular reinforcements and their infantry from the rear in order to hold the line. And in terms of like a temporary stabilization, they were able to prevent Basivka from falling into Russian hands. But even up until today, there are a lot of reports from the Russian side claiming that this region that I'm marking in red over here is actually in a gray zone and is no longer under Ukrainian control. That's something that I cannot verify because we're seeing very, very little information and videos coming out of this region. The only video I saw from the past couple of days is of this Ukrainian armored vehicle that got hit by a mine as it was retreating from the border with Kursk towards Novenka and then Basivka. So we're going to have to wait and see about all this. But having the Russians operating in Novenke and then from there as an extension, Basivka would be extremely dangerous because then the Russians would have an open route both to use their various means of fire and their various physical means of pressure to attack the key road, the key paved road, this highway over here that passes through Yanikivka and makes it all the way to Western Suja. And that's one of the only logistics routes that the Ukrainians are currently using in order to continue supplying their Kursk operation. There's another one that is less reliable, and I'll sort of mark it over here for you guys. It runs adjacent to a rail line and its windbreaks over here. and it's not really paved. It's not a highway like the R200, which is a well respected and understood road that's always been used. But those are really the two routes that are recognized right now. There probably are unofficial routes that we don't know about based on just looking at satellite imagery, but they're going through open fields entirely, and so it becomes more difficult, especially when you reach that sort of like late February, early March season, and vehicles get bogged down. It's of course more difficult, and even if you do use open fields, we're still looking at a corridor of movement that is pretty narrow. We're looking at a width of the Kursk region's entire salient being 15 kilometers, and that is dangerous because that's within the range of a lot of the shorter range artillery that the Russians are now moving in south of Kurnovo, because that's where it's been stationed for a while now, but it could actually be moved further south at this point and stationed on some of the new hills taken over by the Russians. You have mortars, of course, and now you're going to see longer range FPV drones and some of the shorter range fiber optic FPV drones targeting those individual Ukrainian vehicles. And so vehicular losses are beginning to increase in a similar manner to what we saw during the flanking maneuvers north and south of Bakhmut during the latter portions of that urban battle. But not to zoom in and look at the one other location where we have information of the Russians entering, that would be Zhuravka over here. It's not the first time that there was actually an opportunity for the Russians to enter, but it was before the entire Kursk operation happened, and there were just sort of like positional warfare with the Ukrainians over here. So the Russians understand this region pretty well, and given their momentum from Nikolaevo, Darino, it is certainly possible that they entered into this location. That's what they're claiming. A lot of Russian sources are repeating this, and this is something that will have to be verified definitely, because then from there you could have the Russian forces advancing along the paved road southwards towards some of the other Ukrainian locations on the rear, and that would also be a means by which to exert pressure onto the R200 highway. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for, but I'm not going to change the map, obviously, before we get proof. Over here, the Russian forces have been able to capture another 7 square kilometers of territory in the direction of Loknaya. The Russians are really beginning to pinch away at whatever remaining Ukrainian sort of like leeway or buffer zones they have to the west of the populated areas they retain control over, and what I refer to as the spine of Kursk, because Ukraine really has reduced. They've been reduced by the Russian advances to only holding on to a single spine of populated areas that sort of runs vertically. You could see it over here in this red perimeter, and it starts with Molai Loknaya and ends with Sujo. And that's really the core of where the Ukrainians are currently defending. And all the areas to the west that were like open fields or ridges or valleys that the Ukrainians used to drag out the fighting, those are just being systematically taken over by Russian forces. When it comes to the situation over here, some Russian sources claim that all of Lebedivka has been taken over, but I'm not changing that marking yet until we get proof. And the Russians are only about 2 kilometers away from Loknaya itself. And right now, they are within really, really razor thin margins of arriving at Mlaya Loknaya. My mapping is actually really generous to the Ukrainian side. Some Russian sources are actually claiming that elements of 34th Independent Motor Rifle Brigade, it's a unit that was recently moved in. It's a pretty sizable unit. It was responsible for defending and just being situated along the line of contact in the Zaporozhye region near Huliapoli. So it's understandable why the Russians would move them, because it was at a high priority part of the front line, and now they could be used for actual offensive potential. So they're operating around here with some of the 22nd Spetsnaz Brigade's forces, specifically the 1st Battalion, I believe. So they're working in tandem, and they were actually able to infiltrate into Staraya Sorochina, according to Russian sources, and gain a foothold in one of the streets over there. And by extension, they're now beginning to knock on the doorstep of Malaya Loknaya. But again, there's no footage of this yet because there is a lot of operational secrecy over here in the Kursk region that we're not experiencing in other parts of the front line. The developments here are extremely sensitive for both sides, but especially for the Ukrainians. And so the footage that we do see is usually just from rear strikes. And so just to give you guys an idea of that, over here we do have footage from February 27th, before the Russians got very close to the core of the town. And an MRAP that the Ukrainians had moved in was destroyed during a troop rotation. It was just sort of stationed over there on the road, and Ukrainian forces were getting in and out. And that's when the strike occurred. So the Russians have been closing in and striking a lot of the vehicles moving in and out for a while now. And there's also a lot of ambiguity about what's going on with Orlovka, Marivka, and Novaya Sorochina, because the Russians are in the process of cleansing the entirety of Pogrebki. and they're also already shifting their focus to Luknaya, which means that the villages to the north over here and their adjacent positions like tree lines and windbreaks have the potential to be compromised. And I'll show that with this drawing over here. You can see how they could be flanked depending on the way this continues to develop. And so we're looking at a Ukrainian garrison that is in an extremely concentrated region. It includes several ranger regiments. It includes 92nd Assault Brigade, at least some of its elements operating around here, 22nd Mechanized Brigade. Some of the heavy mechanized brigades are operating here, 95th Air Assault. 36th Separate Marine is more so focused on Sverdlikovo and the defense of the Sumy border. You have the 47th Mechanized Brigade, obviously, operating around here, 1st Tank Brigade, and a couple of territorial defense units. So in terms of like the actual strength and the quality of the Ukrainian units, it is very high in this region. But they are attrited at this point. They've now received many reinforcements and rotations in recent months. They've been told to hold on to an extremely tight sliver of land. It's very narrow, and so you can understand why casualties would be higher as a result, both in terms of vehicular losses and manpower losses. But it's been compensated by the fact that the garrison that has been committed to this region is pretty strong, and that's why they've been able to hold the line despite the logistics being so narrow and thereby making any movement extremely complicated. But if there's really going to be finitude to it, given the like small surface area covered by these villages, and so the Russians are now finally beginning to actualize that and beginning to chip away at some of the populated areas. Although the Ukrainians are really strongly resisting and fighting for every single house, you can say. And that's why the clashes are continuing to rage on, and we're not receiving any like concrete proof just yet because those battles are not over right now. And the Ukrainians are doing everything they can to extend the fighting to prevent the Russians from them advancing southwards along this specific paved road all the way to the northern outskirts of Suja, because then they'd have the opportunity to basically close in on the city from all directions. And is also why they tried to like previously counterattack in order to have this sort of an insurance belt south of Suja and try to stabilize the situation around there. Now, as I was saying, the Russian garrison around here continues to expand, chipping away at Russian units that are either like during their sort of operational rest phase or deployed to parts of the front line that are less critical. And so Russian forces are diverting those elements from other locations. And you can see some of those units over here right now that are extremely active, including from the naval infantry forces and from the air assault regiments and a couple of other infantry brigades, motorized rifle regiments that were created over the past couple of years, all of them involved. And so the Russian forces trying to maximize to the best of their ability the disparity between both sides in their manpower pools. Now, when it comes to the deal that I was talking about, there was a loan agreement signed today between the Ukrainians and the UK because Zelensky visited the UK after leaving from the United States. And Keir Starmer agreed to give the Ukrainians a loan package that amounts to $3 billion. And so this is supposed to just be one of those initial sort of loan deals, because right now the plans from the EU as a whole, and the UK isn't a part of the EU, but just in general from European nations, is to increase substantially the amount of aid being committed. And a lot of it will be done through a pool of 20 billion euros that is being planned by individual EU countries, and that's being spearheaded by Kalas, actually. And then besides that, there's also proposals to utilize the seized Russian assets that are currently held up in Brussels as a means of helping Ukraine pay back loans, because they are going to look to purchase a lot of the EU weaponry and equipment to help fill up their stockpiles. So that's the proposal that's currently being brought up by a lot of European countries. So the loan package given to Ukraine by the UK will allow them to purchase whatever weapons they need. So it's up to Ukraine's discretion. And the way it will be paid back is through those frozen assets. So right now, what the EU is doing is they're using on a very small scale the profits generated by those assets that have been seized. And they've not just been seized by the EU. The EU has about, I believe, $198 billion of Russian assets frozen in its bank that they took from the Russian central bank, of course. But besides that, there's also another 102 billion that are holed up in other G7 countries. So potentially all of that could be committed. But there are a lot of arguments about why it won't happen, both from a perspective of trying to, prevent the Russians from retaliating in a similar way or creating a precedent that could be dangerous for the EU countries in the future with their own assets. And then also the dubious legal arguments. So all of that is like a factor in why it hasn't been enacted yet. but it's sort of like sort of compromise and sort of way of kicking the can down the road and allowing Ukraine to receive some additional funding in the meantime is to take the profits generated by those assets that are currently held up in the Brussels consortium and then giving those to Ukraine. So as of now, about I believe 4.6 billion or 4.7 billion of those profits have been used and given to Ukraine over the past year, and those numbers are expected to substantially increase as loan agreements are being drafted, additional ones with various countries spanning from Germany now with the elections over and the new potential chancellor being in support of those sort of policies. Same thing with Spain and France, and the list goes on. And even putting aside everything that's going on with the frozen assets and that entire discussion that it continues to rage, just one other proposal is that a lot of that frozen material, a lot of the money will be used as collateral to ensure that the Russian side ends up reconstructing Ukraine, paying for the rebuilding of a lot of the destruction through that money, and then that would be a way to still benefit Ukraine without seizing the money and then using it for some sort of military purpose. But regardless, the EU is looking to loosen its fiscal rules in order to free up to $168 billion to create an EU instrument for defense investment. That would include, obviously, building up the defense stockpiles for the EU itself, but also then in return helping out the Ukrainians to a certain degree. So that's also something that's being looked at very closely by EU countries. And it also comes as Denmark's now opening up one of its major facilities for production of ammunition, including small arms, 155 millimeter shells, and 120 millimeter mortar rounds. So that's supposed to be up and running in the near future, according to the Danish side. And it also comes as the United States is seriously considering cutting off all aid to Ukraine. This is extremely important to look at because after the entire public conundrum between Trump and Zelensky that occurred yesterday, there is now a demand by the United States that Zelensky publicly apologize to Trump for what they can believe to be disrespect on his end. And right now, sort of the mediator between the two of them is Starmer. He's trying to ensure that things go back onto the right track from Ukraine's perspective, but nothing is confirmed as of now, and there's still a standstill between the U.S. and Ukraine. And so there are very serious considerations that all aid will be cut off to Ukraine. That includes military aid, so giving missile systems, air defense systems to the Ukrainians. It also includes taking away some of the missile systems, the air AD systems that have been given to Ukraine over the past 3 years and putting them back into American stockpiles. That's being considered. It also talks about cutting off just the basic sort of aid training and ammunition and all those shipments that are currently going on a daily basis with American rail and American ships that are coming to Poland from Germany or from America directly and then moving into the Ukrainian border, because that's still happening. There's still a lot of contracts that the U.S. government or U.S. companies have signed with Ukraine that will continue to actualize throughout the entirety of 2025, and a lot of those could be canceled and could be permanently halted if the United States decides to make some sort of policy change, because the current aid shipments are a consequence of Biden's final orders during his lame duck term in office, and those are supposed to sort of drag out for the next couple of months. And so what I'm just trying to say is that it's an entirely real possibility that aid will be completely cut off if there isn't some sort of public apology and if there isn't some sort of rapprochement organized by the UK. And then the entire conversation of what the EU is able to do, what it could feasibly achieve and provide the Ukrainians while also building up their own stockpile and increasing their own percent of defense spending as a percentage of GDP. That's going to become extremely topical. So I'm going to continue covering it. And thank you all so much for watching. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.